Welcome to today's conversation on investing in women's rights to promote national security. With our guest today, Jennifer Klein, who is a visiting fellow at Yale University Law School's Center for Global Legal Challenges, and Professor Rose McDermott, who is the David and Mariana Fisher University Professor of International Relations here at Brown University. I'm Susan Moffett, the Director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy here at the Watson Institute. So this year, the Taubman Center is focusing on three themes: the cost of living, the value of democracy, the price of security. And Jennifer Klein's work really speaks to all three of these and the ways that they intersect, especially in the context of global women's issues. Jennifer comes to us with a rich array of expertise that really renders her unique for these conversations at the intersections of these themes. She has had a dual appointment as both the domestic policy advisor to the First Lady and Special Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy in the Clinton administration. More recently, during the Obama administration, she served as the Deputy and Senior Advisor in the Office of Global Women's Issues at the State Department. And she served as Senior Advisor on women's issues for the Clinton campaign and transition team. She is also an alum of Brown University and Columbia University, so welcome back. We're delighted to have you back. And also joining our conversation today is Rose McDermott, who's a world-renowned scholar of international relations. Rose has authored over 200 academic articles and 4 books, and another one on the way next year on inequality for women in the global context. She is also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and one of the principal investigators of WomanStat, which is the most comprehensive compilation of information on the status of women in the world. So thank you, Rose, for joining us as well. Our conversation today is going to proceed in the following way. Jennifer will start us off with about a half hour or so of comments, and then Rose and I will engage in some questions, and then we'll open up the floor to all of you. We're delighted to see so many of you here today, so we will all mind our airtime, and we'll all ask direct questions and share the air with our colleagues. But now, would you please join me in welcoming Jennifer Klein.
And I didn't know that about you, so now I'm going to be super careful when I cite my statistics that I'm getting it 100% right, because I rely on WomanStats. So advancing rights and opportunities for women and girls around the world is both the right and the smart thing to do. Women's rights are now recognized as fundamental human rights, and in addition, women are critical to solving virtually every global challenge. So investing in them is also a strategic imperative to advance critical U.S. foreign policy interests, including economic prosperity, stability, and security. I'm going to talk about 3 things. The first is I will give the very condensed version of an entire law school class, don't panic, very condensed version on international human rights law as women's rights as human rights. Second, I'll lay out what I think is the strategic case for advancing women's rights and opportunities. And third, I'll talk a little bit about what it means to put this in practice. What does it mean to put women at the center of diplomacy and development? So first, let's talk about women's rights and human rights. 2 decades ago, at the 4th World Conference on Women held in Beijing in 1995, 189 nations gathered, and Hillary Clinton proclaimed that women's rights are human rights. This was a seemingly simple statement, but it was hugely controversial at the time. She was, first of all, representing the U.S. at a UN conference in Beijing, China. She had been urged not to go by cautious forces in the United States government, and certainly, if she went, not to speak about human rights at a conference which was known for not being all that hospitable to human rights. But at the same time with which the United States was trying to develop a warmer relationship. So she not only went, but she specifically set out to, in her own words, push the envelope by calling out a litany of violations of human rights. Things like honor killings, gender-based violence, forced abortion and sterilization, infanticide, and really rocketed these issues to the world stage and powerfully, I think, made the case that they were issues of fundamental human rights. So this seemed shocking at the time, but grounded in a history of international human rights. So what are international human rights, and how did the doctrine and institutions develop? So first of all, they are rights that belong to everyone, everywhere. So what does that mean? It means that international human rights examines conduct that's internal to state sovereignty. So the rights exist no matter where you live, what country you live in, and things like sovereignty and culture do not trump them. It attaches rights to individuals. So they apply to people without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, or any other status, and they're not conditioned on things like property ownership or literacy or taxation. And governments must not only protect those rights, but they must organize themselves to respect those rights. So it has a negative implication, and the negative implication is nations must not obstruct an individual's exercise of their human rights, but it's also an affirmative obligation to prevent human rights violations and to ensure the exercise of human rights. Where did this all start? So the first conceptualization of and public use of the term human rights took place at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in 1944. So this is where the UN was formed, which was done in recognition of the need for a new post-war international organization to succeed the League of Nations. But the secondary purpose of the UN, this organization to be, was to promote respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. And in fact, in the first article of the Charter of the UN, it really articulates that a core purpose for the UN was, and I'm going to quote this, to promote and encourage respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. Shortly after, in 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which really was and is a remarkable document in many ways. It really codified the description of human rights that I talked about earlier. It basically said that human rights exist simply by virtue of being human. They don't need to be granted or legislated, that these rights belong to everyone without any of the distinctions that I mentioned, and that they exist everywhere, that they're rights that are not conferred on by protected by the state or the government, that rather the individual has these rights in every context. And I won't read the whole quote, but at the 10th anniversary of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt had what I love. It's just a great description of what human rights are. And she says, you know, where do human rights begin? In small places closest to home, so close and so small that they do not appear on any map of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person. And she talks about how they exist in neighborhoods, in communities, on factories, on farms, and every person has those rights inherent. So that was the first thing that was pretty stunning about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But the second thing was its definition of human rights. So it covered political, social, and economic rights, including things like the right to social security, the right to work, the right to education, to health, and even the right to just and favorable remuneration, which is interesting. We can get back to this later, that those are considered human rights because we don't have those everywhere in the world. More to come on that later. In the years following the adoption of the Declaration, a number of covenants and institutions grew up to institutionalize and protect the rights enshrined in the Declaration, and sometimes this is referred to as the era of institutionalization. The Declaration has influenced most national constitutions since 1948. It's been a foundation for national laws, international laws and treaties, as well as a number of regional and national institutions that protect human rights. And it's also interesting to note that during this period, civil society organizations were founded and grew up as well. So places like Human Rights Watch, the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, Amnesty International grew up at the same time as part of this evolution. However, by the 1960s, it had become clear that a general plea for non-discrimination did not suffice to guarantee the protection of women's rights. And what followed was a series of conferences and treaties that were aimed at securing and protecting women's rights specifically. So the first was held in Mexico City, and it laid the groundwork for the adoption of a very well-known convention called the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is known as CEDAW, which is arguably the most important document guaranteeing women's rights. So what's the significance of CEDAW? Again, it was really comprehensive. It addressed women's rights within political, social, economic, cultural, and family life. So let me talk about the substance and the process a little bit. So the significance of it was, as I said, first of all, in its breadth. It gave precise and actionable definition and protection to a broad range of women's rights in marriage and family relations, including property and inheritance and access to health care. It explicitly mentioned family planning. It established the principle of equal protection for women as citizens in their own right, entitled to vote and to have other legal benefits. It talked about things like the rights to education, to equal employment, to equal pay, to formal employment. And it also really interestingly took on the notion of culture. So Article 2 of CEDAW requires state parties to take all appropriate measures, including legislation, to modify laws, regulations, but also customs and practices which constitute discrimination against women. And again, that might seem like a litany of things, but the notion that it took on customs and practices was hugely significant at the time. In terms of procedure, it's used to petition for enforcement against domestic laws. So it has an enforcement mechanism in the form of a CEDAW committee that meets regularly to review the progress that all the member states that have ratified CEDAW are making to address violations of the treaty's provisions. And it also gives individual parties the right to petition the committee if they have not been able to redress their grievances locally. Sounds significant? It is significant. So what are the limitations? The first obvious one sitting here in this room is that the United States has not ratified CEDAW. 6 other UN member states, only 6 others, have not ratified CEDAW. They are Iran, the Holy See, Sudan, Palau, Somalia, and Tonga, and the United States. So entire books have been written. I bet Rose has written 1 or 2, at least some articles, on why the U.S. has not ratified and what are the implications of the U.S. not ratifying. But for today's purposes, I'm just going to say, and we can talk about this later too, but I'm just going to say very simply that treaty ratification is very difficult generally. Getting 2/3 of the Senate to agree on anything, I don't even need to finish that sentence these days, is obviously pretty difficult. Second, there are some pretty controversial provisions in CEDAW, things like abortion and family law that some conservatives oppose. And some even make the argument that we don't need CEDAW in the United States because of the relatively equal status of women in the U.S. as opposed to in other countries that have ratified CEDAW. And it's really important to note that countries can have legal reservations to provisions of CEDAW, which has minimized its impact in many countries. So you can have a situation where there's a country that has ratified CEDAW, Saudi Arabia, Yemen are 2 examples, but they have a relatively poor record on human rights. So that was the first conference which led to CEDAW. After that, every 5 or so years, a women's conference was held that was focused on particular issues. So for example, in 1994, the Cairo conference focused on and talked about the relationship between gender equality and reproductive rights and health. And as I said, every 5 years or so, with slightly different focuses, violence, very, very important issues, these conferences were slowly building toward the notion of embedding women's rights. But in 1995, there was the 4th Conference on Women, as I mentioned, which was a pretty significant conference in a number of different ways. First, it was 189 countries that generated these commitments. Second, they adopted, the 189 countries adopted the Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action, which set strategic objectives and actions in 12 different areas of concern. So again, everything from education and poverty, economic empowerment, violence, political participation, even media, and technology. And the other reason that this conference, in my mind, was particularly notable was for the presence of an impact of a parallel conference of civil society organizations that was attended by over 1,000 people. The Chinese government, by the way, put that civil society conference at Huairou, which was a smaller city about an hour outside of Beijing, because they were actually concerned about the impact of this big civil society conference. But it was really the first of its kind, and it was, imagine a time before the internet and social media, so it was an amazing opportunity for the exchange of ideas, for the development of really a sisterhood among advocates who were coming from very, very different places, but had some shared experiences and many shared goals. So an explosion of activity followed in the 1990s, after Beijing, as women's groups and human rights organizations demanded change. Donors in the media, governments, the United Nations, and other international organizations responded with greater resources, laws, and new mechanisms, and greater attention to women's rights and gender equality. The activity really focused renewed attention on CEDAW and the treaty monitoring committee and legal instruments provided under CEDAW. It also spawned greater commitment from the UN. So there were a couple of, there are many, I'm just going to mention a couple of big markers where the UN and other organizations really began to focus on this thing called gender integration. So one example was the inclusion of sexual violence in the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court. Another, in the year 2000, the UN Security Council adopted its first resolution specifically on women. It was called Resolution 1325 on Women, Peace, and Security, which addressed violence against women in armed conflict and the role of women in peacekeeping. So that was a body that had not taken on these kinds of issues before. So again, hugely significant that they did so. And then in 2010, the creation of UN Women, which was a UN body dedicated to advancing gender equality and women's empowerment as a key to global progress. So that was my quick outline of the human rights basis for women's rights and an overview of the architecture that supports women's rights. So a different argument has emerged as well. We know that women's rights and opportunities is the right thing to do. Why is it also the smart thing to do? And why is this relevant at all to U.S. foreign policy? I always start this section in talking about strategic importance by noting that I don't want to minimize the power of the moral argument. We live in a world where 1 in 3 women have experienced physical and sexual violence in their lifetimes. An estimated 20 million people are trafficked and trapped in modern slavery, which generates $150 billion of profits for the perpetrators. And 5 million girls each year are forced to marry under the age of 15. So it's hard to not have that sense of moral outrage, to appeal to the sense of decency that these are rights and these are crimes, and these things should be prevented, full stop, because they're wrong. But it's important as this moral case is, it's not the only reason, I believe, to care about gender equality. And indeed, in this world that we live in, which sometimes feels dangerous, it always feels interconnected. That case might not be convincing enough for some to put it high on the foreign policy agenda. And so I think it's also important to note that we have compelling evidence that advancing rights and opportunities for women and girls around the world is not simply just. It's a strategic imperative, and it's one that we ignore at our peril. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, just in a few categories, this we could talk about all day, and I'm happy to go back and talk more about the evidence that supports this, but just to give you a few examples. Let's look for starters at the issue of economic growth. Leading international institutions and private sector corporations have concluded that when women participate in the economy, poverty decreases and GDP grows. So, for example, the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation has estimated that closing the gap in women's labor force participation across OECD countries will lead to gains of 12% by 2030. Another institution, the World Economic Forum, which, by the way, is not considered a bastion of feminist theory, now puts out an annual gender gap report. And it measures the gap between men and women in a country in terms of economic and political participation, access to education, and health survivability. And again, this analysis shows that in countries where the gap is closest to being closed, those countries are the most economically prosperous. And private sector companies have done similar analyses. So McKinsey released a study that assessed the potential gain of women's equal participation in the workforce at $28 trillion, or 26% of annual GDP, if the gap between men and women were closed. And that would happen by 2025. And we also know that investing in women has a multiplier effect because research shows that women are more often use their invest their economic benefit in their families and their communities. Education. Let's take education as another example. Let's think about the transformative effect that educating a girl has. It's often said that educating a girl is the best development investment that can be made, and that one extra year of schooling beyond the average can increase women's wages by 10 to 20%. We also know that that educating girls has tremendous impact on the health of their children. The decline in maternal mortality over the past decade, 50% of that decline in infant mortality is attributable to increased educational attainment by women and girls. And finally, women's participation in peace and security processes. So on this one, there has been historically less evidence, because there have been fewer women involved in peace negotiations, but the evidence is growing. And we know a couple of things. We know that higher rates of female participation in government mean lower levels of corruption. It's correlated or associated with lower rates of corruption. And that a growing body of evidence suggests that women bring unique contributions to making and keeping peace. So they raise issues like human security issues, like health and education, that are increasingly important to making peace longer lasting. So we've learned that when women participate in peace processes, the resulting agreement is 35% more likely to last at least 15 years. And finally, in the area of security, we know that higher levels of gender equality are associated with lower propensity for conflict, both between and within states. So as you can see, there are strategic and moral reasons to protect and advance opportunities for women around the world. And what has developed, and what I spent 4 years working on at the State Department, was implementing that vision. And I'm feeling like maybe I should stop and talk about that more as our discussion.
I think hearing some about implementation now would be good.
Okay.
We'll ask you more of the questions.
Okay. I want to start by saying that this has been a very bipartisan issue. So often these days when I'm talking, I feel like when I talk about what's not happening in this administration, it's also very important for me to point out that that's not because this is a Republican administration. So I do feel like these issues are seriously under challenge right now. But it is also really clear that they have had a lot of bipartisan support. So, you know, leaders from Madeleine Albright to Condoleezza Rice to Hillary Clinton to John Kerry to Colin Powell have emphasized that women are critical to solving virtually every challenge we face and have put them at the center of our diplomacy and development efforts. You know, some people talk about this as smart power, you know, the line between hard power, meaning sanctions and military force, and soft power, which has historically been the word used to describe diplomatic and development tools, are blurring. And many people, including the secretaries of state that I mentioned above, think about combining both strategies in a notion of smart power. The use of women in particular, or the focus on women in particular, in the Obama administration really started at the top with President Obama's national security strategy, where he literally said, and I'm going to quote him, "Countries are more peaceful and prosperous when women are accorded full and equal rights and opportunity. When those rights and opportunities are denied, countries lag behind." So what followed was a series of pronouncements and executive actions and documents that really enforced that goal. So the first thing was that this president appointed an ambassador at large for global women's issues and made that office permanent, which doesn't actually mean permanent, and we can talk about that later because it was done by presidential memorandum. But footnote, and we can go back to this too, that the U.S. Senate, in a rare moment of bipartisanship, actually just passed a law to make the office permanent, and that really means permanent. Obviously, another Congress could repeal their law, but that's harder to do, although less hard to do than it used to be. But in any case, that was a strong message from the president that this office was important and that these issues were important. And there was a similar architecture put in place also by executive order at USAID. So there were these sort of two parallel offices which reported directly to the secretary at the State Department and directly to the administrator at USAID, both created by President Obama and Secretary Clinton. So in 2010, Secretary Clinton issued the first ever QDDR, which stands for Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review. And what that was a policy document that was supposed to set the agenda for the State Department and USAID for the next 4 years. And it was modeled after something the Defense Department already did, which was called the QDR, the Quadrennial Defense Review. And it really aimed to improve the conduct of foreign policy and development. What was interesting in this context is that it really made the case that integrating women into diplomacy and development, again, it's not just a responsibility, it's an opportunity because it would further U.S. foreign policy goals. And it really stressed that this would happen across all diplomatic efforts, whether that be traditional bilateral and multilateral relationships, strategic dialogues and public diplomacy, relations with civil society, community leaders or other non-state actors. And by reaching out to women and girls and integrating them into the diplomatic mission, it would be ensuring more effective diplomacy and development. What followed from the QDDR, which was sort of this 130-page broad document, was a very set of specific guidance that the Secretary Clinton issued in March of 2012, which again was the first of its kind. And it was sent as a cable to every State Department bureau and mission, and it outlined how to take this vision that was outlined in the QDDR and really implement it throughout the department in 4 key areas. So it talked about strategic planning and budgeting. It talked about programs, because the State Department, as does USAID, actually runs some programs. It talked about monitoring and evaluation. You know, what we measure is what we do. And it talked about management and training. And it also included an appendix of examples of gender integration at the embassy level, in multilateral and bilateral engagement, and in policy and program initiatives, because believe me, it was not obvious to everybody at the State Department what it meant to integrate gender. And I'll just give you another one example of how we actually put this in place, which was, again, led from this guidance. One of the things, as I said, was management and training. So we reformed the Foreign Service Institute training to include the first ever course on gender and U.S. foreign policy. And under the Secretary's leadership, they began development of a gender module. So not only as the first year Foreign Service officers went out into the world, they would have taken this course. There would be a standard module that would become part and parcel of all of the FSI training programs, whether they happened in person or virtually, that would focus on gender and U.S. foreign policy. So I think I will stop there. The only thing I would say is beyond those, and we can talk in more detail about those, that was sort of the overall architecture, and then there were very issue-specific work that we did. So there was work on violence, there was work on women, peace, and security that, again, further embedded the focus on women throughout diplomacy and development.
Thank you. Thank you. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about some models that we may want to follow, either countries or regions of countries that you think stand out for us to model, both in terms of what they've accomplished at the aggregate level, but also for what they've accomplished at intersections, right? So for women for whom multiple aspects of their identities render them vulnerable through socioeconomic status or citizenship status, race, ethnicity, or religion. Who stands out as models for us?
Well, that doesn't necessarily quite get at the second part of your question, but models are always the Nordic countries, which is the easy answer, but it's really true, which is really pretty much on every metric. There are greater levels of equality in most of the Nordic countries. I mean, again, this is not quite getting at your question, but there are countries that are taking steps in the right direction, and in fact, they're sort of embracing my my theory that there's a moral reason, but there's also a strategic imperative, and not necessarily that they're models for us to follow, but they're interesting case studies. Japan, for all obvious reasons, right? So Prime Minister Abe came into office and noted that there was a big demographic problem in Japan, which was that they needed more people in their workforce because the workforce was aging. And so he has created a whole architecture and infrastructure for getting women into the workforce because it was an important strategic priority for his government. You know, he's received some criticism for the reasons that he's doing it, but so again, that's not exactly what you're asking, but it is. And you know, another great example, which is again a little bit counterintuitive, is Saudi Arabia, right? So we've all been reading in the news about how Saudi Arabia is about to in June. They haven't actually done it yet, but will lift the ban on driving. So again, is that my model of thinking about women and gender equality more generally? Probably not. On the other hand, they are taking steps in the right direction, but again, they're taking steps in the right direction because there are reasons for it. They need more people as the oil revenues are declining. They need more people in the workforce, and they have a high unemployment rate.
Yeah. And continuing with this idea of steps in the right direction, I'm thinking about your work advising now nonprofits and governments also. And I wondered if you could talk with us a bit about some of the different roles that the actors could play in this. Governments, nonprofits, private sector, are they working on different aspects of this? Do you see natural niches for them or important places for them to focus their energy? Or are they all working on the same thing?
Well, I think they're definitely natural niches. I mean, I think a lot about, I think about it right here in this country, the importance of civil society. And, you know, as I mentioned at the Beijing conference, you know, one of the things that was striking about it was the fact that you had 189 countries gathered talking about, you know, women's rights and human rights. But probably more importantly, you had the 1,000 people gathered at Wairau, and pushing the envelope, and really forcing governments to pay attention to issues, to take action. So I think that's a significant role, and as I said, it's a role that needs to be played everywhere in the world by civil society. And I think, you know, governments, for all obvious reasons, I firmly believe that they should focus on the rights of all of their citizens, including women, and particularly women who have overlapping reasons for discrimination against them. But when they don't, I think there's, you know, the most important role is civil society and international bodies that pay attention to these things as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the ripple effects, and your mention of the memorandum that had originally created the office and now it's congressionally created reminded me that, you know, one of President Trump's first actions in office was his memorandum rescinding federal funds for organizations that support and promote abortion. So this was originally a Ronald Reagan memorandum. It's rescinded by Clinton, put back in place by George W. Bush, then rescinded by President Obama, and then now the restriction is in place, again with Trump. And so on the one hand, is this the usual politics bopping back and forth when there's a new president, or how is this moment and this president different, and the ripple effect that may have?
Yeah, can I just add on to that? I'm just curious, because I think it's something we're all conscious about how you see the, not just abortion, but other issues related to women being rescinded or not under the current administration, and especially for our prominent future female leaders in the room, what actions can we take as civil society to try and foster these really important rights from your perspective of having worked institutionally?
Okay, there were so many questions there. All really good ones. Okay, so on global gag, just to start with, you're exactly right. It has been historically a political football between Democrats and Republicans. But I would want to note one really important thing, which is that this imposition goes far beyond what any other Republican administration has ever done, because it applies the restriction. It applies only to foreign NGOs, which is an important distinction. It sounds like a nitty-gritty one, but it's an important distinction. It only applies to non-U.S. based NGOs. But what it says is, if you even talk about abortion, you will not receive U.S. funds. And what is different about this one is that it applies to all U.S. global health programs. So even programs that focus only on HIV/AIDS. There's a program which many of you may be familiar with called PEPFAR, which was actually put in place by President Bush, the President's Emergency Response to AIDS. I missed several parts of the acronym, but you get the idea. And it is actually the hugest part of American global health funding. I think it's about a $50 billion or maybe even bigger program at this point. And this would apply to PEPFAR funding as well. So that's dramatic. And now I've forgotten.
Ripple effects of that. So
that's.
And then Rose's.
Yeah, I was just asking you to reflect on differences that you've seen between the administrations you've been working on and the current administration in terms of what was being rolled back and what we can do in civil society to try and push for these rights to be protected, expanded, conserved.
Yeah, so I made the point, which I really believe, that global women's issues has been a traditionally bipartisan, with the exception of abortion rights, which is obviously a huge exception. But as I said, it is more dramatic in this administration. But it has been historically bipartisan. And I think two things are happening here which are not necessarily related, but it is having a particularly detrimental effect. One is a pretty dramatic disregard for the State Department, in general, for USAID, for the place of America in the world as a world leader. I mean, this is obvious, and I think the use of executive action. So these two things are sort of on a crash course. And while this administration has talked about and actually has, the president's daughter talking a lot about women's issues. First of all, on the substance, I take issue with the things that they've decided to focus on. So there was big fanfare at the UN when Ivanka Trump announced the Fund for Women's Entrepreneurship. And in my mind, it is very difficult to replace vast amounts of funding for development programs in things like family planning or girls' education or health generally, because there have been huge budget cuts, 38% out of the State Department budget, with a fund for women's entrepreneurship. And it also has a very narrow view of what entrepreneurship is, right? So you can fund training programs for women, but if For example, in my mind, if they cannot choose the spacing of their children, it's very difficult to have women be employed. So I think on the substance, there's been a real retrenchment. I think we're in a really difficult period. I think just in terms of the, as I said, the level of respect and understanding of the role of the State Department and of U.S. aid, I think there's been a dramatic difference. And I also think just sort of the sheer use of executive power, which, you know, President Obama got criticized for too. So it's not like this was a President Trump invention. But I think, you know, and again, this is a broader conversation about U.S. Government at the moment. It's really hard to do anything legislatively, so presidents have more and more, and actually I recently taught a class on executive action, and you can see that in recent presidencies, the use of executive action has gone up. So I don't mean to suggest that I blame him for using it. Many, many presidents are, but there's a danger to it, right?
Yeah.
Let's broaden our conversation even further. Let's take some of your questions. Yeah.
So you mentioned this morning and a few minutes ago about how there's kind of a fundamental misunderstanding about the need for women's rights with higher up officials in whether it be the State Department or in the Senate. And do you think, or do you see any trend towards in ensuing decades having more female representation in the Senate or in higher up official places of higher up positions? And do you think that will ultimately change how the Senate has approached kind of not ratifying CEDAW? Is that how you say it?
Yes.
CEDAW.
Yes.
And do you think eventually, if there was more diversification, that could transition into a hard law?
So I actually think that we've seen a lot of progress. And I think, you know, the fact that you have McKinsey doing a study of women's economic participation, or the UN, even in the year 2000, passing a resolution on women, peace, and security, and countries around the world who have devised, coming from the 1325, the resolution that I talked about that the UN passed, national action plans on how to inject women's issues into peace and security negotiations and resolution. I think, you know, if you look at, there's been a steady march of progress. And you see progress on particular issues, not only in the leadership or the acknowledgement that these are important issues to focus on. So I don't want to overstate. You know, when we were talking this morning, I was telling you my funny war stories about walking into the State Department and talking to people who really didn't see this as part of the work that they did. But if you look globally, I really do think there's been a tremendous amount of progress. Obviously, the more people you have in, whether it's in office in the United States or around the world, or in positions of power in multilateral organizations, who either are women, but they don't have to be women, they can be people who understand, as I said, the strategic reason to include women in their work, the better off you'll be, but don't lose sight of the progress we've made. It's hard at this particular moment.
Piggybacking off of that, what do you think, from a legal perspective, is yet to be done, or in your perspective, would be the most effective law on paper that could be ratified perhaps in the U.S., but also, I'm curious, that we're still missing? And the second part of that question is, there are, as you said, so much progress that's been made on paper, and what are the current enforcement mechanisms to make sure that these laws have teeth?
Laws where?
Laws, I mean, in America, let's just stick to America.
Okay. So I don't know if I would say this is the most important, but I will give you a fact that I think is really stunning, which is that in no country in the world are women paid equally, and in every country in the world, women do more unpaid work than men. Now, if you're asking me to choose, you know, is that, if we fix that problem, would we fix the problem generally? And I would love to hear your answers on this question as well. I would say no. On the other hand, you know, equal pay has tremendous effects on not only individuals, but on entire families and communities. and both of those have tremendous impact on women's ability to participate in the workforce. And that seems like a pretty basic change that if we could get there, it would actually have tremendous benefits. You know, I think, I would love to hear your views, because I think you could have an argument for hours about what is the most important.
It's hard, and I think the U.S. context also makes very clear the important aspects of intersectionality that matter here, right? Because on average, women make 77 cents on the dollar for men, but for black women it's 63 cents, and for Latinas it's 55 cents. And so it's important to take that variation into account as we're crafting our law. But there's this tricky part in the United States, you know, about focusing on employment and focusing on violence too, because there's one estimate that suggests that collectively victims of intimate partner violence lose 8 million days of paid work per year. So that's a huge, if you pool all together all the victims of intimate partner violence and how much paid work they're not getting because of violence, we also have to take violence into account also. So I see it as a two-track platform here in the United States, focusing on the employment dimensions, also focusing on the violence dimensions, but how to do it. So much of this in the violence space is happening at the subnational level. There are a lot of states, variation in state laws on what happens with intimate partner violence, for instance. There's variation there too. But the other tough aspect of this in the U.S. is, you know, girls outperform boys in school consistently. Higher graduation rates from high school, higher college attendance, and then the lines cross. And that's true across all racial and ethnic categories in the U.S., and then the lines change, right, when we hit the labor market. And that has a lot to do with the structure of employment and the lack of support for childcare. But the lack of support for childcare not only affects the women with children, but affects the women without children because of the implicit biases that employers have towards women, thinking you're going to be less productive because there's a risk that someday you might have children. So I don't know what we should do, right? I don't have an answer on what we should do. But I think we have to address both the employment piece and the violence piece. These two things interact with each other.
And now that you've raised violence, I mean, the other sort of obvious area, to really not answer your question, the other obvious area is health, right? There are huge gender disparities and racial disparities in healthcare, and sort of, if you think about that almost as the base, it's hard to not choose that as the most important topic.
I'll just add a couple of things. I think the closest we came to a law that would have enforced equality was the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, which we lost in the early 70s at sort of the height of the previous round of the second wave of the feminist movement. And Jenny Mansbridge has a wonderful book on this called Why We Lost the ERA. And Why We Lost the ERA has an answer that's quite similar to how and why Trump got elected, which is white college-educated women, like Phyllis Schlafly, led the opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. And it was a lot about the fact that they wanted not to work, and they wanted their husbands not to be penalized by having to compete with women who earned equal amounts of money. It's a complicated but very repetitive issue across class issues. The other issue which both Jennifer and Susan raised, which I think is really important, is a lot of the debate in the United States, especially the most recent round with Sheryl Sandberg and her, lean-in argument, really relates to a very small percentage of the American population, which are rich, well-educated white women, right? And that's really great, but the part of the argument about how leaning in requires leaning on underpaid, often women of color, in order to do the child care and the elder care and the domestic care that women don't have time to do or don't want to do, is the other part of the issue. And I think that speaks to, a fundamental biological fact that divides men and women, which is that women have to trade off reproductive and productive work in a way that men do not, right? So that trade-off between reproductive and productive capacity requires a trade-off that leads to things like differences in paid work, right? If you take 20 years off from the workforce to raise your children, you know, is it surprising that you're not going to be paid at the same level as somebody who's been in the workforce 20 years? And so that is the downstream consequence of earlier inequalities, especially around not having paid child care leave. So America is one of 3 countries in the world that doesn't have 2. The other one really did. So is it Papua New Guinea? Is that the other one? So it's us and Papua New Guinea. And everyone else goes, hey, it's actually good to help people have healthy babies and help women have healthy children and to pay for that. I mean, in Denmark, you get a monthly stipend every month for 2 years when you have a baby because they actually want you to invest in things like bonding with your children because then it leads to less violence when you grow up, right? I mean, it's not like these things don't have consequences. And so, you know, this is, again, to not answer the question in an even broader way.
Sorry.
You know, I think that there's lots of pieces that are intertwined around not having paid child care, not leading to not having equal pay for equal work. Because in some ways, the work itself is equal, but the history of work has often been truncated by female reproductive demands that are not equivalent between men and women. Even if men help with child care, they're not pregnant for 9 months. And pregnancy is demanding, physically and intellectually and all these other kinds of ways. So, not that I would know. But these things are intertwined both legally and socially in ways that have consequences well beyond that. And so thinking, as with healthcare, as a society, who do we want to decide is part of the in-group that we're going to protect as the collective, and who are we not? And I think that those decisions have moral evaluations that we are fighting over at the moment as a broader society.
Yeah.
Hi. You mentioned earlier that sometimes people have different reasons for like defending legislator that like helps for women's equality. So it's either a moral reason or it's like more strategic. Do you see a difference in the execution of action or the legislator that follows that because of the reasons behind it?
That's a good question. Yes. I mean, I think. That's a really good question. I think there's differences in how it gets done. Do I think the result is different in the end? Maybe not. And it's probably very dependent on the context and the country and the issue that you're talking about. But you know, I think there are instances where it is hard to protect somebody's rights, and maybe the benefit that you see long term is long term. You're not going to see it for a while. So in that sense, I guess the answer is yes. It would sort of be better to argue it from a rights point of view, but whether you're actually going to get there in the first place is a different question. But I think, you know, that's why for me, I always come back to saying, you know, first and foremost, it's an issue of rights, because if you're just relying on it as a strategic imperative, like, you know, to take the Saudi example, they may get enough women in the workforce by removing restrictions on women's right to work, for example, that male relative doesn't have to provide permission, or that they can drive to work. And you're never going to get to true equality if you can sort of eliminate some of those restrictions and meet your actual goal of increasing the number of women in the workforce. So I don't know if anybody has a...
Hi. So you talked this morning about wanting to combat social norms as a way of affecting change. And it seems like some of our most like kind of sticky, persistent things hindering that change are around social norms that stem from religious reasoning. So like our not wanting to pass abortion, or these strong like the paternalistic kind of veneration of the man in the household are a lot in this country around religious issues, which is really hard to combat. So how would you go about combating those sort of social norms that come from, religious context?
I mean, I can take a stab at it. One is, I think that when we talk about religion, we have implicit assumptions in the United States that certain religions are better than other religions about women. But if you actually look at the data, it turns out that all religions kind of suck except the Buddhists. So I'm not saying the Buddhists are good with regard to the Rohingya, but if you look at Buddhists worldwide, they tend to be more endorsing of equal rights for, like ants and spiders and women and people and, whatever, dogs and horses and, things. There's one group that tends to be worse, and they're the Hindus. They definitely are worse. But if you look at religions like Catholicism and Islam, they're not actually that different. So there's only 2 or 3 countries in the world where you have higher rates of successful female suicide than male suicide. So the rule about suicide is that way more women attempt and way more men complete. And it's because women tend to choose non-lethal methods. They tend to do things like take pills so they don't die as often as men who shoot themselves in the face, where you have a much higher rate of dying. Part of that has to do with, it turns out, and they know this from studies with women who've tried and failed to commit suicide, is they don't want their bodies to look ugly, and so they don't shoot themselves. And shooting yourself is a really effective way to kill yourself, and that's how most men tend to kill themselves. But one of the few countries where it's true is Peru. So Peru has a lot more completed female suicides than male suicides, and it's one of the few countries in the world where you have dominant Catholicism. So it's not necessarily attached to a specific religion. So that's the first point. The second point is, what that really tells us is that most religious structures are patriarchal. And so part of what you're trying to dismantle with religion is a patriarchal structure of which religion is a part. So the way that I've come to think about it, and you can totally disagree, is that religion is one of the mechanisms supporting the patriarchy rather than the thing actually creating the patriarchy. And so it doesn't mean that that isn't one of the places you can try and chip away at it, but there's other foundational places where you can chip away at it. And as you change laws and regulations, it can change the way that particular religions evaluate those kinds of downstream effects. But again, you can disagree.
And what are some of those foundational?
Things like laws, like, equal pay for equal work, paid child care leave, those kinds of things. I think that a lot of them are social and cultural. So my big thing, which most people really disagree with, is I think one of the problems is too much intrasexual competition among women for male attention. So they never engage in the kind of coalitional collective action that can lead to equality because they always allow men to get in the way. Men never allow women to get in the way of collective action. They just they engage in coalitional action, and they have great wars, and they kill each other, and then they, get the spoils of said war. And so part of it is thinking about how to educate around intrasexual competition in a way that allows effective collective action among women.
Are there examples of that sort of coalitionary bonding for women or females, like across the
Not in large scales that I'm aware of, unless you are.
Sophia?
Yeah, this kind of goes back to the question about religion, but one of the things you mentioned earlier was the ability to kind of take on culturally embedded ideas of gender in one of the concepts you were talking about. So if you could talk a little bit more about kind of how to take that on in a way that is respectful of target populations, but also really sticks if this is a culturally embedded idea.
Well, I'm glad you asked, and I was going to go back to sort of the practitioner's view of that question. You have to break down what religion prescribes, right? So, in my work, I worked a lot on FGM. And one of the things, and family planning in Ethiopia is another example. There are huge religious differences, obviously, to state the obvious, when you're talking about women's reproductive health. There are also areas where there's not actual religious teaching one way or the other, or various religions have various different interpretations of their own religious teaching. And in fact, you can work within the religious religion and work with religious leaders to actually change culture, and it can have a tremendously beneficial effect. So
That's a really
to
good
take
point.
to take the example of Ethiopia, we worked closely with religious leaders in the north of Ethiopia to be the people in their communities to talk about family planning. Because once the religious leader had said, it's okay to have family planning, not only the men, but also the women in the community were able to listen and to access family planning services. And, you know, there's a well-known NGO that worked in Senegal, still works in Senegal, to combat FGM. And the woman who founded it, Molly Melching, that was her insight. And she was actually pretty unique at the time of thinking about engaging with religious leaders. But that's exactly what she did. And she realized that if those messages that FGM had been a traditional practice, it had been happening for hundreds of years, but it didn't have to happen. There was no religious prescription requiring it in families, that actually that would lead to part of the solution. It doesn't address all of your question, but.
But you had another question, or were they related?
Or did I meant to answer both.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I think that was
Sorry.
part of it. I think, yeah, no, I think that addressed both parts, because I was asking about in terms of implementing it in a way that's respectful, but also in a way that sticks. But I think what you just said.
Yeah, so I think one thing that I found interesting about kind of the pay inequality is, like, to me there are maybe like two kinds of, you know, people who are really who can take action on that, and one is of course the state, and then also the employer itself. And so I'm really curious in terms of maybe just staying within the realm of the United States, just as a focus. You know, what has in the past been more effective, or are there differences? And then, you know, what are kind of some models that we can follow in terms of, like, really who is able to create, you know, effective change?
So there's actually 3 components when you talk about equal pay, right? Only a third of equal pay is actual discrimination. The other 2 pieces are occupational segregation, right? So women end up in lower paid fields. And the third is what Rose was talking about earlier, which is caregiving responsibilities, right? So women who literally are out of the workplace for periods of time to have children, to care for children. And so those 3 things add up to, when we say equal pay or the pay gap, those are the 3 things that add up to the pay gap. And Susan made a really important point earlier, which is when we talk about the pay gap, there's actually a range of pay gaps, which are, as you heard, dramatically different based on race. And I'm so glad you asked the question, because I actually think it speaks. You can talk about equal pay, and you can also talk more broadly about the roles that lots of different players have, particularly in the United States. And I think this is one where you're exactly right. The private sector has a huge role to play. So, you know, there are laws on equal pay. They're not as strong as I would like them to be, but there are laws on the books that prevent discrimination. There are executive actions that have been taken to strengthen those laws and to require companies to report unpaid data, for example. That was one of the executive actions that has just been revoked, but it was there, and it could be there again. But you're exactly right, which is that companies and employees themselves have a huge role to play. And one of the things that I've worked a little bit on is the notion of pay transparency. So what we've learned over time, and there are examples. There's a company called Glassdoor that makes pay data accessible to individuals so that they know what they're negotiating when they're negotiating. But if you require companies to make their pay data transparent, or if you, even better, voluntarily get them to voluntarily make their pay data transparent, what you learn is that the pay gap goes down over time in that particular either company, industry, group of companies. So absolutely, there are, I think, businesses in particular on that issue, but also you know, nonprofit organizations that are engaged in thinking about this can come up with lots of creative ways to get the private sector two things. 1, to get the private sector to be better actors, and 2, to help individuals to do other than lean in, to be able to negotiate for themselves. There is, by the way, really interesting data that shows that when women negotiate for pay, it ends not so well for them. That when men go in and negotiate for raises, they get raises. When women negotiate for raises, they are penalized for those negotiations, for pushing that.
You just have to negotiate in a different way. Women have to negotiate in a different way.
Exactly. They're perceived differently.
Yeah. I just would like to mention a few other strains of research that I think are relevant to this argument. One is a really interesting psychologist in Boston named Maureen Perry Jenkins, and she looks at women who work in minimum wage jobs for like Walmart, right? And part of what she shows is that there's enormous self-selection of women into those jobs because of their caretaking responsibilities, right? So like if you're taking care of not just your children, but in many cases, especially, you know, Hispanic communities, people are taking care of brothers, sisters, cousins, and everybody's taking care of parents because parents don't die like they used to, right? And so it's both elder care as well as child care becomes an increasing demand on everybody. And so she talks a lot about self-selection, whereas men in those situations, they just won't work. They'll do things like go on welfare as opposed to take minimum wage jobs. And there's various reasons for both of those, and that's interesting. Another is a sociologist in Minnesota named Phyllis Moen. A lot of these people actually work on work, but they're gendered components. And she talks about how a really important aspect of getting to equal pay has to do with work flexibility, which again relates to this child care issue. If you're having to drive your kids to school, then, you know, maybe you can't start at the same time as, you know, somebody who can go into work at 6 a.m. And so maybe what we need to do is actually change the time that school starts to be, you know, more commensurate and you know, thinking about other kinds of structural features that cause more flexibility in the time demand. So everybody works 8 hours, but people get to choose which 8 hours they work, for example. And the other is this work that this economist at Harvard, Claudia Golden, has done, where she shows that you get a lot closer to pay equality when people have interchangeable talents. So her best example is pharmacists. Like, you know, if you work every other day, if you work the morning and somebody else works the afternoon, your job doesn't actually change. You just, you know the medication, you fill it out, whatever. But there's some jobs that are less interchangeable. And so coming up with mechanisms by which we can make jobs both more flexible in terms of timing and more interchangeable in terms of tasks leads to greater pay equivalency, not just across gender, but across race and across sexuality and across all these other things that ordinarily would otherwise introduce discriminatory aspects.
Yeah.
So we've been talking a lot about like policies and initiatives to help women's rights, and another part of that is like evaluating the impact. So I was just wondering if for increasing women's rights, is there a better like framework to evaluate the impact? Because I know for poverty, for example, there's been a lot of like different questions about can we do that and how do we do that? And one of them is looking at statistics and seeing can we see a difference in pay rate or seeing that gap just like diminishing. But are there other? Do you think there is a better framework for just like for talking about women's rights, or do you think that's still like a questionable framework that has to be talked about?
Well, I'll mention just something that I've been trying to start here at Brown in the course that I teach on gender and public policy, and that's to develop a gender impact analysis that we would do for every policy, the way we might do an environmental impact analysis or an economic impact analysis, but not just treat it on the binary, right? So think about gender in a much more complex way, and then apply that framework, and this is what I have my students do, and we're not quite yet to take it public, quite ready to take it public, but it forces us to think about gendered implications of any policy in lots of different ways to help us understand, for instance, the higher dropout rates among boys or higher incarceration rates among boys, the higher rates of homelessness among transgender youth, for instance. So, and how might our policies about homelessness have differential gendered impacts. So what place that we start is there are gender impact analysis, of course, that the Nordic countries do. They tend to treat gender on the binary, though, and so we start with those as our point of departure, and then for each policy, think about how could we construct a model that would fully express gendered impacts, and then get in and think about what data are there and what data are not there. And we explore like the power dynamics, right, behind where we're collecting information, where we're not collecting information, but then come up with some conclusions based on the data that we can get. What would a gender impact analysis look like? But another piece of our recommendations are always in here where we need to get more data because we just can't answer the questions.
And interestingly, we did two somewhat similar things at the State Department, and I wish your work had been done when I was there. But as part of the policy guidance that the Secretary issued, which I mentioned earlier, and the parallel guidance at USAID, everybody for every program or every policy was required to do a gender impact analysis.
That's great.
Which was, very novel at the time, somewhat controversial and very novel at the time. And the second thing we did was we launched, we actually had a day-long conference on gender data, which everybody, again, thought we were somewhat crazy. In fact, there were a number of people arguing that the Secretary of State should not spend her entire day focused on gender data. And she was the one who insisted that she was going to spend her entire day. But one of the things that came out of that was we actually launched an organization called Data 2X, which had two purposes. One was to do a landscape analysis to figure out what we knew and what we didn't know and where the data gaps were. And the second was to actually start launching partnerships to fill those data gaps. So while I was still working on it, we launched a partnership to fill data gaps on civil birth registration and civil statistics, because in so many countries in the world, they don't record births or marriages, which has fairly detrimental impacts generally, but particularly for girls. So just to take one example, we looked at big data and the power of big data and how you could get information from sources that didn't exist 5 years ago.
So this is a wide open terrain for more work, which I hope you'll do. Yeah.
Exactly.
When you say analyzing policies and gender impact statements, but trying not to use the gender binary, what does that look like in when it's implemented to focus on gender as more of a not as a binary?
So in some ways, it's trying to gather data on more than the binary, and that is the first hurdle for a lot of this, and some of it requires thinking hypothetically also. So some of the impact analysis is what is the data that we have, but then thinking about even in the absence of the data, what would it mean if we think about how we structure our prisons if we didn't have gender just on the binary, or again, it comes up in homeless policy, for instance, but other aspects of employment policy too. So some of it is a matter of data. Where do we have data? Where do we not have data? But another piece of it is then just thinking conceptually, why does the binary not help us here? Or where might there be differential impacts if we press beyond the binary?
So is that also, just out of curiosity, is that also about dividing it up by demographics, so older women versus younger women, by race, by these other things, or is it just
it's absolutely trying to think about the intersectional dimensions here, right? Because we're not just a gender, but a gender plus so many other things, and thinking about how those all come to bear on impact.
I think this is going to be more of an observation than a question, but you guys have been talking a lot about women as a very broad term, slightly bringing in race and ethnicity, but have yet to mention women who don't identify as heterosexual, which I think plays a big role into a lot of things, not only in the U.S. but outside. So I was wondering if you guys could maybe give your opinions on how you have to approach women who don't identify as heterosexual, and how that changes policies and makes implementation more difficult, because I think that's really important.
Well, that's a piece of what we try to get at with our gender impact analysis too, right? And so trying to specifically gather data on women who don't identify as heterosexual and think about the implications of that, because they're absolutely, if we look at the employment,
housing.
Exactly. So it's a key and absolutely integral part in doing our analysis.
And similarly, again, sort of the practitioners from my standpoint, it's something that we thought about all the time at the State Department. So if you were, or when you were working on development programs, so you, as you well point out, you can't think about women as a category without understanding all of those overlapping identities and places where there are discrimination. And you know well that in lots of places in the world there's a lot more discrimination against homosexual people than there is against women, and that was always sort of front and foremost. And when you were thinking, I mean, the State Department issues human rights reports, as I was talking about earlier, and one of the issues, again, this was predated me, but we talked earlier about adding things that were not traditionally seen as human rights violations. When talking about sexual orientation was added, that was a huge change. And Secretary Clinton actually went and gave a speech about discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation at the Geneva Human Rights Council, exactly for all the reasons that you're imagining. But one other important thing to keep in mind, which I didn't talk about, is, one of the things I worked on at the Clinton Foundation was this sense of what progress had been made and where the gaps still are. And there's sort of these broad categories where you can say there's been a lot of progress in health, there's been a lot of progress in getting girls educated, and there's been less progress in economic issues or political participation or in security issues, whether that's conflict resolution or personal security. And so those are sort of very broad topics. But within those, there's tremendous differential based on women who are marginalized for various reasons. And again, to return to Susan's point, in some cases we don't even know because we haven't collected that data, and that's why what you're doing here is tremendously important.
Other questions? Yes.
You mentioned some of the challenges on collecting data for this topic and also on just the data gaps and knowledge gaps that currently exist. I was wondering if the second framework that you talked about, the strategic importance or motivation instead of more of the human rights framework and more motivation, does that help to close that gap at all? Does that bring in other types of data or ways of collecting data that were previously ignored with the human rights framework?
Sort of yes and no. I mean, I think it's actually I would draw the arrow in the opposite direction. It's like when you start collecting data on issues like, for example, time use. There was like historic data dearth on looking at time use by gender. And once people started collecting that data and understanding the huge gap in time use, it provoked policy change. Not done yet, but it's at least on the map. So, we used to have a thing in our office that said, what you measure, you do. And I think, as we're collecting more and more data and understanding, child marriage is another example. When you actually start learning when people are born and you start learning that actually they're 9 when they're married instead of 12 when they're married. 12's young, but 9's even younger. So it actually, I think, spurs action on the strategic side.
Yeah, and I just would like to mention one other thing about data collection. I've been involved in this big data project for, 10 or 15 years, and there's some parts of the world where it's just really hard to get data, right? We call it the Somalia effect, like we'd run these missing data things, and where don't we have data? And, you could always count on Somalia not having data. And, there's some places where it's very hard. The other thing is that you start to realize that some places look a lot better than others that are actually worse because some states are better at investing money and actually counting and measuring these things. So, for example, if you look at the data, Switzerland looks like they're way worse on rape than Nigeria. I can promise you they're not worse. The difference is Switzerland puts a lot of money into tracking every case of rape, every case of somebody saying they've been raped, tracking through whether that person was indicted, whether or not the perpetrator was incarcerated, whatever. And they put a lot of money into that, whereas Nigeria puts no money into following anything. And so they look like they have 0 rapes because they don't count them. So part of it is recognizing that measurement is part of actually recognizing the severity of a problem. Russia's this way with HIV. They don't count it, so they look like they have really low rates of HIV. But in fact, Doctors Without Borders will tell you it's a lot higher than parts of Africa, right? So, part of it is just your issues around measurement actually reflect both your biases going in, but hugely affect your behavior coming out. And so how those things get measured really matters.
You have time for another question? Yeah.
So I get really worried with obviously our current administration. I know that there's been bipartisan support for policies that help women in the past, but now it's just I feel like we talk here at Brown about a lot of the kinds of policies that could do good things, but none of those are going to get passed right now. To what extent do you think, from your experience in the State Department with Secretary Clinton, do you feel like social movement tactics have any sort of persuasion of the conversation on our level versus like the conversation at that level is actually going to be helpful, like things like the Women's March? And I would love to get all of your reactions to that. Like what do the data show and what are the conversations like?
So I am bizarrely hopeful. First of all, nothing lasts forever. It feels like it does right now, but nothing lasts forever. And second of all, I think if there is any silver lining to what we are experiencing now, it is that no one is complacent. And I think, the Women's March was the first of many manifestations of the power of people coming together. And I had some issues with the Women's March, which we can also talk about. But it was powerful, right? And despite arguing about how many people were there were a lot of people there, right? And a lot of people around the world, not just physically in Washington. And I think, what you're seeing is that we have two things. So you can look at this as a positive or a negative, right? There are two things that are preventing bad things from happening. Well, three things. The press, so, holding on to that free media, which is in question, but we still have it. The judiciary, which is literally, on the front lines, who knew this would happen, of stopping illegal executive actions, and civil society and civic action and grassroots movement. And I think that is hugely important. There's a friend of mine just wrote a book, not just about a year ago, David Cole, who's the legal director of the ACLU. And I can't remember the name of the book, but it's something like Public Action. And it's about how important civic action has been through the course of American history. And when you see it in context, and when you see the power that civic action has had, it sort of is heartening, because even when you have a federal government that I'm presuming you don't agree with, but that is really aggressively doing some things that you find difficult, there's a power in civic action, which I think is important.
And if I could add a fourth, in the American context, it's states and localities. It's
Absolutely.
the subnational
Absolutely.
space. One of the things that struck me, again, we don't know the actual counts, but like how many people turned out in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, for instance.
Right.
And so even though we have a long history of discriminatory policy at the state and local level coming from the states and localities, there are also more permeable spaces, some of the research suggests, than the national level. So the national level interest group space in the United States is so dense. Civil society action can be tough to break in at the national level. The state and local levels can be more permeable. There can be more space to exercise voice. There's, again, a long history of discrimination at the state and local levels, but they also provide opportunities for action and an opportunity to check on whatever the federal level is doing.
And on a policy level, there are some great things happening. I work a lot on paid leave, and while, way before the Trump administration, there was, woefully little happening on paid leave at the federal level. You have 5 states and localities, some localities that are passing paid leave laws. And does that, do away with the need for this to happen at the federal level? Absolutely not, but there's an opportunity for actual forward motion. And you have states like New York and California where they are, meeting their obligations under the Paris Climate Agreement. They are, they're doing a whole host of things regardless of what's happening at the federal government level, which are hugely important, right? You don't look convinced, but.
We have time for just a couple more questions. We haven't heard from here.
I have a question. You mentioned human trafficking. You mentioned global modern slavery. The U.S. State Department's rolled out a new program on ending modern slavery, and within the past month, they funded a global fund to end modern slavery, as well as the British government. So the question we have is, how important do you view this in the context of women's security and equality? And then secondly, how effective do you think something like the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, an NGO, will be on handling global issues such as this?
I think it's hugely important. I mean, just the sheer number and effect of trafficking is, overwhelming. And having the U.S. government and many other governments around the world paying attention to it and actually taking action is hugely important. And the particular organization that you mentioned is very well respected and does great work. I mean, it's obviously a huge problem, but if you even think about the level of recognition in recent years, it's gone from being something that people didn't talk about, people didn't think about, other than the advocates who worked on it and the people who are victims of trafficking themselves and their families, to an issue that is, high on high level, at high levels, being discussed at the UN and other important international fora. So. And interestingly, that is an issue where there has been also a lot of bipartisan support, which not incidentally is the reason you're actually seeing forward action on it.
Let's take our last two questions.
So you say that you would have some things to criticize with the Women's March. So I was wondering, what do you think that we can do to improve our current grassroots movements in feminism?
Oh boy. So I'll say something that I think might be controversial even at this table, which is the thing that I found about the Women's March, which was mostly great and mostly heartening, was that I felt that it became the vehicle because people were frustrated and also because women's issues are a lot of different issues. It became the vehicle for everything else. So, I was there on the mall and I saw every sign you could possibly imagine for climate change, for, which I pick on because that's what my husband works on, for every range of issues. And I sort of felt like, this is about women. This is about, unique forms of discrimination that we are facing, that we have just experienced. And so that was my personal frustration. And I also feel that in terms of the sort of broader implications for feminism, and again, this is the part that I think will be really controversial, is, I do think that there is something that is important about focusing, that women bring all sorts of identities, and even the use of the word women is being binary in my thinking. But I also think that there is something that we sort of need to, because women are perceived around the world as women, for the most part, that there is something unique to that discrimination that women face around the world, and sort of like we shouldn't lose sight of that in being inclusive and understanding that women bring a lot of identities with them, all around each day. So, disagree.
I like to operate in a both-and framework. So here I'm thinking about two different strands of scholarship. One that cautions about what happens in big umbrella organizations, that even if and this is not just for organizations representing women, but other kinds of organizations, that even though they profess to be inclusive and progressive, they continue to prioritize the most privileged of their members and marginalize the least privileged. But that said, to be aware that this happens, there's some neat research on state level policies related to violence that find that when you see both and activism, the big umbrella organization plus niche organizations that will represent just Black women or just Latina women, they're more effective in getting policy done. So big umbrella, yes, can marshal a lot of power and resources, but the real importance of having niche organizations too. At the subnational level, we see some effectiveness that comes from that approach. Yeah. One last question.
Rose, you mentioned one book, How We Lost the ERA. I was wondering if you two have any book recommendations.
I have two. Kristen Luker's Abortion and the Politics of Motherhood really gets it's kind of an ethnographic study that gets at how identities are, it's more than interests that identities really get embedded. And then It's Torben Iverson and Frances Rosenbluth's book. Help me with the title. It makes the argument about how we need. Send me an email, or we'll post it on the Taubman website. It has work in the title. That'll narrow the Google search. But the argument is how important it is to change the economic structure, and that when you change the economic structure, you will see changes in norms too. And Shirley Chisholm's Unbought and Unbossed.
I don't think this is the one
hormone.
you're thinking of, but What Works? And there's a subtitle to that. It's about changing gender norms, but that's not the actual subtitle, by Iris Bohnet, B-O-H-N-E-T, which I recommend reading. I'm in my own work, I'm thinking a lot about, as I was talking earlier today, you all heard about changing attitudes and social norms. So I read that book just recently, and it's not actually all that helpful because I think it talks about working around norms rather than actually changing norms, but it is still a really interesting book to read.
I'll add one too. The Sex and World Peace book that Valerie Hudson did is, I think, a really great comprehensive thing. And there's also a diatribe that's up free on the web by Silvia Frederici on, can't remember the title, but I can tell you the first line. First line is, you call it love, we call it unpaid labor. She's a feminist and she's a communist. Not that that will shock you, given the first line, but.
Well, on that note, Ariella, thank you, Jennifer Klein, for joining us.